Hands behind your back. Now. The command exploded through the quiet hallway long before Elijah Harper understood why a police officer was shouting at him in front of his own door. The sound carried down the polished corridor of the 32nd floor, sharp enough to make the recessed lights feel colder, sharp enough to freeze the easy rhythm of a man simply coming home. Elijah turned, still holding his key fob, sweat drying on his neck after 14 hours in a counterterrorism briefing downtown. His breath caught in his chest when he saw the gun hand resting against the officer's holster, the narrowed eyes, the certainty of a man convinced he had just found a threat. Elijah had seen that look before. Not here, not on this floor, not 5 feet from the door marked 3204 with his own name printed neatly on the mailbox plate. His voice stayed steady. I live here. I'm FBI. But Officer Ryan Caldwell stepped forward as if the badge were nothing more than decoration. His face tightened. Fake badges are easy. Bags of equipment. Strange behavior. Turn around. Elijah kept his hands visible, steady, open, because he knew how fast a moment like this could twist into something else. He thought of his wife. He thought of his son. And he realized, with a weight he had carried his entire life, that even the safety of home could vanish in one heartbeat. Before diving into this story, tell me where you're watching from. And if you want more powerful stories like this, subscribe to the channel and give me a like. It helps more than you know. Elijah Harper had entered the Pinnacle lobby just 20 minutes earlier. Exhausted but relieved to be finished for the night. His shirt clung to him from the long day, and his gym bag pulled at his shoulder. He joked with his wife over video call as the elevator rose, Sarah reminding him to drink water, Jamal waving a science project he wanted to show him, laughter carrying softly until the doors slid open on the 32nd floor. Elijah loved that small routine. It helped him forget the tension of the briefing, the warning from headquarters about a credible threat, the nagging fatigue that came from 15 years of domestic counterterrorism work. Upstairs. He walked the familiar hallway, nodding at the quiet framed art, the warm lighting, the sense of order that made this place feel like a refuge. He never imagined that someone watching from another floor was already reshaping that night. Across the building. In apartment 1806. Margaret Ellis sat in her living room with the lobby camera feed on her television. She watched it often, as a habit, as a hobby, as something she convinced herself was just staying aware. She had been a schoolteacher for decades and believed she understood danger when she saw it. When Elijah walked in wearing athletic gear, carrying a heavy bag, sweat across his brow, her mind filled in blanks she had created for years. She had seen a recent news segment about burglars targeting upscale buildings. The faces on those stories blurred into one shape in her memory. And tonight, Elijah fit it. She forgot, or chose not to remember, that this was the same man who had fixed her sink last week, kneeling on her kitchen floor as he tried to be helpful, offering small talk while she thanked him without meeting his eyes. She forgot that he held the door open for her. She forgot that he had lived here for 5 years. Fear rewrites facts faster than truth can catch up, and fear was all she saw. Upstairs. Elijah reached his door and lifted the key fob. The soft beep recognized him instantly. 32 floors below. Ellis watched that same moment on camera, yet convinced herself the entry looked too smooth, as if someone practiced could imitate it. She dialed 911. Her voice trembled only a little. There's a suspicious man in the building. Black male, 40s, large bag. He got into the elevator. I've never seen him here. The dispatcher asked if he forced his way in. She hesitated, then said, he looks like he doesn't belong. That was enough. Officer Caldwell, cruising near Lexington Avenue, responded out of habit. He had been raised to trust white collars in wealthy neighborhoods without question, and with 12 profiling complaints behind him. Patterns had carved themselves into instinct. He imagined a crew using cloned key fobs, imagined danger where none existed, imagined a story that justified the rush of adrenaline that always came before an arrest. Elijah felt his phone buzz with an FBI alert. Threat credibility high. Stay vigilant. And he laughed under his breath. He whispered to himself. Even at home? He didn't know how close that question was to unfolding in real time. At the same moment, the elevator doors opened behind him. Caldwell stepped out with a pace too fast to mistake for routine patrolling. One hand near his holster, the other already preparing for confrontation. Elijah raised his hands instinctively, palms out, showing calm. FBI, I live here. Caldwell didn't even glance at the badge long enough to read the imprint. His mind was locked. Vision narrowed. Convinced he had just caught someone pretending to belong, his voice rose sharply. Turn around. Hands behind your back. His body cam captured everything. The key fob log behind Elijah clearly displayed his name and timestamp. The mailbox plate beside the door spelled out E. Harper. The doorman, Carlos Rivera, buzzed in through the intercom, saying, "That's Mr. Harper. He's one of ours." But Caldwell talked over him like the truth was an inconvenience. Move your hands where I can see them. A door opened down the hall. Rebecca Lang, a young attorney in apartment 3206, stepped out after hearing the argument. She began recording on reflex. At first, she didn't question what she saw. A man in gym clothes, a tense officer, a bag that looked heavy. But then Elijah's badge glinted under the lights, and she leaned in. The badge was real. The calm in Elijah's face was real. The fear was real too. Her breath caught. She whispered, "Wait, he's telling the truth." The video would later make her shaky voice famous, but in that moment, she only stood there, frozen, watching justice distort itself in front of her door. Elijah kept his voice even. "I am complying under duress. This is racial profiling." Caldwell tightened the cuffs, ignoring every sign, every confirmation, every ounce of proof that contradicted the story he had built in his head. Elijah didn't resist. He didn't argue. He had learned long ago that calm could save a life, even when innocence should have been enough. He stared at his own front door, inches away, the place where he should have felt safe, and he wondered how many years a man had to work, how many badges he had to earn, how many times he had to prove himself before the world saw more than the color of his skin. When the elevator doors closed behind them, and the muffled sounds of footsteps faded, the hallway grew quiet again. Only the soft red light above 3204 remained, blinking gently, as if marking the moment a sanctuary had been violated. The 911 call began with the soft rustle of Margaret Ellis shifting in her armchair, a sound too small to predict how much damage it would cause. Yet it carried the same nervous energy she felt every time she watched the lobby cameras. Her living room glowed with the dim light of a table lamp, the television screen casting grainy security footage across her walls. She cleared her throat before speaking, as if preparing for something solemn. "I'd like to report a suspicious person," she said, her voice thin but certain. The dispatcher asked for details, and Ellis leaned closer to the screen. "Black male, 40s. He's carrying a large gym bag. He looks out of place," the dispatcher asked. "Did he force entry?" Ellis hesitated, because she knew the answer, and because hesitation is where truth and fear begin to separate. "No," she said quietly, "but I've never seen him, and he moved like he knew how to get in." She never mentioned the key fob. She never mentioned that she had lived in the building for only 9 months while Elijah had lived there for 5 years. She never mentioned the moment last week when Elijah crouched under her sink, fixing a loose pipe with patient hands while she stood 2 steps back. avoiding eye contact. Instead, she painted a picture of a threat because it felt safer to misinterpret what she saw than to challenge the stories she had carried for decades. Officer Ryan Caldwell received the dispatch while cruising down Lexington Avenue, the hum of the patrol car settling into the rhythm of another uneventful evening. When the information came through, he straightened before he realized he had done it. Possible break-in at the Pinnacle residences. Caller reports unfamiliar male, black, carrying a bag. Caldwell tapped the steering wheel, feeling that familiar rush, part instinct, part legacy. His father had drilled it into him. Rich neighborhoods call for a reason. Trust the residents. Caldwell heard those words even now. Years after his father left the department under a cloud of misconduct, the advice stayed long after the badge was gone. Caldwell activated his lights and turned toward Madison Avenue, building the story in his head. Affluent building, late evening, male with athletic gear, big bag, sweating. He had handled burglary crews before, smart enough to clone building fobs, confident enough to blend in. And the worst part was how easily he convinced himself that this narrative fit tonight. He never asked the dispatcher whether the man lived there. He didn't ask whether the doorman confirmed anything. He didn't need more information. He already believed the version that made him feel sharp, capable, necessary. That certainty was a shield he carried everywhere, and it had already led to 12 profiling complaints, 5 of them sustained. But tonight, he told himself he was preventing a crime. That was always how it began. Inside the Pinnacle lobby. Elijah wasn't thinking about any of this. He checked his phone again, still amused by the timing of the FBI alert. Threat credibility high? Stay vigilant. It flashed on his lock screen just as he walked toward the elevator. He shook his head and whispered, "Even at home?" His breath steadied as he stepped into the elevator. He pressed the button for the 32nd floor. He felt the weight of the day in his shoulders, yet the promise of dinner and a quiet night with his family kept him grounded. He didn't know that someone upstairs had already rewritten his identity in a matter of seconds. Margaret Ellis stayed glued to the screen, watching the elevator lights climb. She had spent years absorbing crime news, letting fear settle into her bones, stories about affluent neighborhoods being targeted, stories about people who didn't belong. She had never questioned why those stories shaped her perception, nor did she try tonight. She remembered her childhood in a segregated Alabama town, the warnings her parents whispered, the invisible lines drawn through neighborhoods. In her mind, those lines still existed. Even here in Manhattan, she believed she was doing the right thing. She believed she was being vigilant. She believed she was protecting the building. But the truth was simpler, and far more painful. She was acting on a reflex that had never been challenged. The dispatcher kept her voice calm. "Ma'am, stay on the line. Officers are on the way. Do not confront the individual." Ellis lowered her phone but kept the lobby feed running, her breath shallow, her heart pounding in a way that felt righteous. She whispered, "Please get here quickly." Though she did not know why she felt urgency, Elijah had done nothing more than walk home. But fear has a way of turning ordinary movements into imagined threats. Caldwell approached the building with a sense of purpose that came from years of unexamined habits. He parked half on the curb, stepped out, and adjusted his belt. He didn't ask the doorman a single question. He didn't wait for backup. He didn't observe before acting. Years of chasing ghosts he often invented, had trained him to move fast. He walked through the lobby, headed straight for the elevator, and hit the button hard enough that the metal clicked. He rehearsed commands in his head, prepared for resistance that he imagined was inevitable. When the elevator doors opened, he stepped inside with the kind of certainty only a man convinced of his own correctness could possess. Upstairs, Elijah reached his apartment door. The fob beeped, soft and familiar. He felt relieved to be home. He didn't know what was coming, didn't know that Ellis had never questioned the accuracy of her own fear, didn't know that Caldwell had already decided what kind of man he was. In the narrow space between the elevator's quiet hum and the soft glow of the hallway lights, a misunderstanding rooted in bias and history was already building momentum. The elevator rose. Caldwell's shoulders tightened. His jaw clenched. He imagined catching a criminal in the act. He imagined recognition from his captain. He imagined control. None of those fantasies included the truth waiting 32 floors above him. When the elevator doors slid open, everything in him locked into place. He stepped out, moved quickly, and the first words he shouted ricocheted through the hallway like a verdict delivered before the evidence even appeared. Hands behind your back. No questions. No verification. No hesitation. It was the moment when the 911 call became something much larger, when someone's fear transformed into someone else's nightmare. And down on the 18th floor, with the screen still glowing in her living room, Margaret Ellis waited with the quiet confidence of someone who believed she had done the right thing. She had no idea that her call would unravel lives. She never imagined that a simple sentence, spoken from the comfort of her armchair, would trigger a cascade of truth, scrutiny, and consequences that would follow her for the rest of her life. The hallway was quiet when Elijah turned toward the sound of the elevator, expecting nothing more than a neighbor stepping out with groceries or a dog tugging on a leash. But instead, he saw Officer Ryan Caldwell advancing fast, one hand hovering near his holster, his expression locked in that hard stare Elijah had seen too many times in too many places. Elijah raised his hands slowly, palms open, because he knew how quickly a routine moment could crumble. "I live here," he said calmly. "I'm FBI." His voice echoed with the steadiness of a man who had spent 15 years diffusing threats, but Caldwell didn't pause long enough to absorb any of it. He stepped closer, boots striking the polished floor with purpose. "Turn around, hands behind your back." It wasn't a question. It was a command fueled by certainty, not evidence. Elijah lifted his badge, the metal catching the hallway light, and said, "Special Agent Elijah Harper, Apartment 3204. But Caldwell didn't even glance at the details. "You can buy those online," he muttered. "I've seen plenty of counterfeits." He moved as if truth were an inconvenience. Elijah kept his breathing steady, shoulders relaxed, because he knew that any tension could be misread in the worst possible way. The first layer of proof sat directly beside them, the electronic mailbox plate showing E, Harper, and S. Harper engraved in stainless steel. But Caldwell walked right past it without so much as a glance. The second layer blinked softly in blue, the key fob log panel beside the door, still glowing with the timestamp from a few minutes earlier, E. Harper, 3204, 19 hours, 42 minutes, 11 seconds. But Caldwell didn't bother checking. He had already decided who Elijah was, and the third layer of truth crackled through the intercom speaker when Carlos Rivera, the longtime doorman, answered Elijah's frantic attempt to get backup from someone who knew him. "Officer, that's Mr. Harper," Carlos said urgently. "He's lived here for years. That's him." Caldwell talked over it. "Step back from the door," he barked, which made Elijah's stomach drop. He had lived through moments like this before, moments when experience, credentials, and identity meant nothing. He had hoped this building would be different. He had believed it was safe. And now he realized how fragile that belief had been. Across the hall, a door clicked open. Rebecca Lang, young, sharp-eyed, wearing a gray sweater and holding her phone out of instinct, stepped into the corridor. She intended only to glance, maybe whisper hello. But the scene froze her. A police officer shouting, a man she recognized, quiet, polite, the neighbor who held elevator doors open, With his hands raised, she pressed record, not yet sure what she was witnessing. Her voice trembled on the video as she whispered, "Is he okay?" Elijah turned his head slightly, not enough to unsettle Caldwell, and said, "Ma'am, please stay back." The steadiness in his tone only made her more uneasy. She zoomed in. The badge looked real. The calm looked real. The fear looked real. And suddenly the narrative she assumed collapsed. She whispered, "He really is FBI." The camera captured her realization. It would later capture the entire country's. Caldwell continued like none of it mattered. "Put your bag down," he ordered. Elijah lowered it slowly, inch by inch, until it touched the floor. "Keep facing forward." The body cam footage showed Elijah doing everything right. Hands visible, voice steady, posture relaxed. But Caldwell's belief was already cemented. He grabbed Elijah's wrists and snapped the cuffs on with a force that made Elijah grit his teeth. "You are being detained," Caldwell said sharply. "For what?" Elijah asked. "Suspicion of unlawful entry." Elijah drew a breath, trying to hold back the wave of disbelief and anger rising in his chest. "I used my fob. I live here. You're ignoring evidence." Caldwell leaned close, voice low. "Criminals get smarter every year." Elijah shut his eyes for a moment. He had spent his entire adult life fighting the kinds of threats Caldwell imagined he was catching, but none of that protected him. Rebecca's camera captured the next moment with chilling clarity. Caldwell lifted Elijah's badge with 2 fingers, squinting at it like he was handling a prop. $20 online, he said again. Elijah's voice lowered, fragile but controlled. "You're making a mistake." "Officer?" Caldwell shook his head. "We'll sort it out downstairs." He pulled Elijah a step away from the door. Elijah's home, his sanctuary, his retreat from long days at the bureau, sat inches behind him, warm light glowing under the doorframe. And yet he stood in cuffs, humiliated in front of neighbors, treated like a stranger in the space he worked so hard to afford. Rebecca's fear turned into outrage. "Officer, he lives here," she said, louder now. "I've seen him. Everyone knows him." Caldwell shot her a glare. "Ma'am, step back." But she didn't move. She held her phone higher. "This is wrong. She insisted." Elijah glanced at her, gratitude flickering across his face for a second before he looked away. He didn't want her involved. He didn't want anyone hurt. But he also knew her recording might become his only protection tonight. Carlos tried again over the intercom. "Officer, I checked the resident logs. That's Mr. Harper. He came through 20 minutes ago. Please verify." Caldwell reached up and snapped the intercom button off. Interference. He muttered. Elijah felt a chill ripple through him. This wasn't policing. This was a man refusing to be corrected. When Caldwell pulled Elijah toward the elevator, the hallway lights reflected off Elijah's face, showing exhaustion, disbelief, and something deeper, something that felt like the breaking of a quiet hope he had carried. That one day, he would be judged by the work he did and not the fears other people projected onto him. As they reached the elevator, Elijah spoke one last time, quietly, almost to himself. "I am complying under duress. This is racial profiling." Caldwell didn't respond. He pressed the button harder than necessary, jaw clenched. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. To anyone else, it was the sound of convenience. To Elijah, it sounded like a door closing on everything he thought he had earned. He stepped inside, hands cuffed behind him, chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. Rebecca recorded until the doors slid shut, until the last sliver of Elijah's face disappeared behind stainless steel. Down the hallway, the soft red light above 3204 blinked in the silence, marking the exact spot where truth had been ignored. Warnings had been silenced, and a man who had spent his life protecting others had been stripped of the dignity of returning home. The ride to the 19th precinct felt longer than the entire 14-hour shift Elijah had just finished, even though it lasted less than 10 minutes. He sat in the back of the cruiser, wrists rubbing against the metal cuffs, breathing slow and deliberate as he watched the familiar streets pass by. Madison, Park, 67th. Places he walked with his son on weekends. Places where he once felt like any other parent coming home. Now he watched them through a cage, his heart tightening with every block. Caldwell sat in the front, silent, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the road as if the truth sitting behind him were an inconvenience he planned to resolve the same way he resolved everything else, with stubborn certainty. When they reached the precinct, Caldwell opened the back door without looking at him. "Let's go," he said. Elijah stepped out, shoulders straight, posture calm, because he had learned long ago that dignity is sometimes the only defense a man has left. Inside. Fluorescent lights washed everything in harsh whiteness. Officers glanced over as the two walked in, some curious, some bored, none yet aware of the storm about to land at their feet. Sergeant Lena Ortiz was the first to sense something was off. She stood behind the processing desk, flipping through reports. When Caldwell approached with Elijah in tow, she didn't look up right away. But the moment she did, her expression changed. "Evening," she said, glancing at Elijah. "What's the charge?" Caldwell answered quickly, almost too quickly. "Suspicion of unlawful entry? Possible burglary attempt?" Ortiz raised an eyebrow. "In the Pinnacle residences?" Caldwell nodded. Ortiz leaned forward, her voice firm but even. "He have ID?" Caldwell hesitated. He showed something that looked like a badge. That made Ortiz stop moving altogether. "A badge," she repeated. She turned to Elijah. "Sir, what agency?" Elijah met her eyes. "FBI, New York Field Office, 15 years. Ortiz's face tightened, not with suspicion, but with the slow, rising heat of disbelief. "Ryan," she said, lowering her voice. "Did you verify?" Caldwell exhaled sharply. It looked fake. Ortiz didn't blink. "Did you verify?" Caldwell didn't answer. That silence was louder than anything he could have said. The moment Ortiz unlocked the cuffs, Elijah let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. She inspected the badge herself, checking the number, the seal, the hologram, details any trained officer should recognize instantly. She picked up the phone, dialed Federal Plaza, and spoke in quick, clipped sentences. 90 seconds later, she hung up, confirmed. She said, "He's an FBI special agent, with active credentials and clearance." She turned to Caldwell, her eyes sharp. "What were you thinking?" Caldwell stiffened, instinctively defensive. Caller said she didn't recognize him. He had a big bag, sweating. Something felt off. Ortiz's tone dropped to something colder. 12 profiling complaints. Ryan, 12. And you still don't slow down enough to check facts? Caldwell didn't meet her eyes. He stared instead at the floor, jaw muscles twitching. Captain David Kwan entered the room then, drawn by the sharp tension that seemed to thicken the air. A quiet man with an unshakable sense of procedure. He surveyed the scene without speaking. When Ortiz handed him the body cam tablet, he watched the footage with a stillness that made everyone uneasy. He saw the key fob light up with Elijah's name. He saw the mailbox plate. He heard the doorman identifying Elijah. He saw Rebecca filming, her voice rising in disbelief. And finally, he saw Caldwell tightening the cuffs. Kwan closed the file with a slow exhale. "Officer Caldwell," he said, his voice controlled. "You ignored every verification available to you. You dismissed building staff. You dismissed the resident directory. You dismissed a federal badge." Caldwell opened his mouth, but Kwan raised a hand. "No, you're done speaking." He turned to Ortiz. "Remove his weapon. Remove his shield. Effective immediately. Desk duty pending internal review." Caldwell's face went pale. Not angry, not shocked, pale, like someone who had never expected consequences to arrive at his own door. It wasn't until later, in a small side room away from the commotion, that Elijah finally exhaled in a way that felt real. Ortiz brought him water, set it gently on the table, and said, "I'm sorry this happened." Elijah nodded. "I've dealt with things like this before," he said quietly. "But never at home. Never like that." His hands shook slightly when he picked up the cup. Ortiz sat across from him. "You want to file a complaint?" He looked at her, tired but resolute. "No, I want everything. Body cam, dispatch call, witness statements. I want internal affairs tonight." Ortiz nodded. "You'll get it." She wasn't soothing him. She was promising him. When Sarah arrived at the precinct 20 minutes later, she moved with the fierce, focused urgency of someone who had been worried before she even heard the full story. She walked straight into the room, wrapped her arms around Elijah, and held him for a long time. She didn't cry. She just held him, breathing against his shoulder, grounding him in the way only someone who knows every part of a man's life can. Elijah's voice trembled when he spoke. "I'm okay." Sarah pulled back and looked him in the eyes. "You shouldn't have to be okay with this." Their son, Jamal. Watch the scene unfold from his grandmother's house, eyes wide as the shaky footage recorded by Rebecca played across social media. He didn't understand everything he saw, but he understood enough. That his father had been hurt, that the world wasn't as safe as he hoped, and that the people he trusted to protect others had treated his father like a stranger. As the night wore on, the precinct grew quieter. Officers finished paperwork, phones stopped ringing, but two men remained awake for very different reasons. Elijah stayed because he needed statements collected, evidence preserved, records secured. This was not just a misunderstanding. This was a violation that demanded sunlight. And Caldwell stayed because he was not allowed to leave, sitting at a desk where his weapon once hung, staring at a blank wall, the edges of his discipline noticed trembling in his hand, in his wallet. A photo of his daughter slipped loose when he pulled out his ID earlier. He held it now, staring at her small smile. Her face had always been a reminder of what he wanted to be. Tonight, it reminded him of what he had become. When Elijah and Sarah finally stepped outside the precinct hours later, the city felt colder than it had when he first walked into his building that evening. A man can work his whole life to build a sanctuary, but sanctuary means nothing if the world refuses to see him for who he is. Elijah looked up at the dark sky, breathed in slowly, and said quietly to Sarah, "This isn't ending here." And she nodded, because she knew it wouldn't. The video went viral before Elijah even made it home. By the time he and Sarah walked through the doors of their temporary safe house in Westchester, Rebecca's recording had already traveled from Instagram stories to TikTok, from private group chats to national platforms, moving with the speed of shock and disbelief. In the first 3 hours, it passed 500,000 views. By sunrise, it climbed past 3.2 million. People watched the moment Caldwell shouted at Elijah in the hallway, watched Elijah raise his hands calmly, watched the badge glint under the light, watched the cuffs snap shut. The silence after the elevator doors closed struck viewers harder than the shouting. It was the sound of a man being erased in the one place he should have been safest. Commentators replayed the doorman's voice being ignored. They slowed down the moment the mailbox plate appeared beside Elijah's door. They added subtitles to Rebecca's trembling whisper. "Wait, he's telling the truth." The world didn't just see an arrest. They saw a story they recognized too well. They saw a man who did everything right, and a system that still punished him for existing. Across the country, reactions poured in with a rhythm that felt painfully familiar. Civil rights groups issued statements before lunch. The NAACP posted a short line that cut deep in its simplicity. "This is why we march." Lawyers analyzed the body cam angles, pausing each frame as if the truth needed a magnifying glass. Commentators on morning shows spoke with outrage, disbelief, and resignation, often in the same breath, and at the center of it all. Elijah sat at his kitchen table, elbows on the wood, hands clasped together as he watched the world dissect the most humiliating moment of his life. He didn't cry, didn't shout, didn't slam the table, though the quiet tremor in his fingertips betrayed the weight he carried. "I just wanted to go home," he whispered to Sarah, who sat across from him, eyes soft but firm. "I know," she said, reaching for his hand. "And the whole world knows it too." Jamal watched the video on his tablet even though Elijah had asked him not to. Children know when adults are hiding something. They know when a room shifts, when voices grow careful. He saw his father with his hands up. He saw the officer shouting. He saw fear, a kind he had never seen on his father's face before. When he looked up at his mother, his voice was small. "Dad didn't do anything." Sarah hugged him, holding him tight, fighting back the ache in her chest. "No," she said softly. "He didn't. That night." Jamal slept in their room, curled between his parents, afraid to close his eyes without knowing they were both there, at the FBI New York field office. The response was immediate. The assistant director sent an internal memo before 10 a.m., its tone sharper than protocol usually allowed. "We protect our own." It read, "This will be handled at the highest level." Agents who had worked side by side with Elijah for years spoke with a mix of anger and protective loyalty, one said. "If they can arrest Elijah with a badge in his hand, what chance do the rest of us have?" another added. "This isn't policing. This is prejudice in uniform." The FBI's legal division quietly requested all NYPD reports, dispatch logs, and unedited body cam footage. They planned to move quickly, not for publicity, but because Elijah deserved nothing less. Meanwhile, in the NYPD Union Hall, the early statements came out with a tone the public had grown used to. Officer followed protocol. The spokesperson said, "He responded to a 911 call and had reason to investigate. Within hours, online reactions drowned it out. People demanded accountability. Protocol doesn't excuse blindness." One commentator said, "And it doesn't excuse ignoring a badge, a doorman, a mailbox, and a fob." Protesters appeared in front of the 19th Precinct the next morning holding signs with simple messages. "Home is not a crime, and who protects the protected?" Officers watched from inside, understanding that this was not a story they could contain. Margaret Ellis, the woman who placed the 911 call, experienced her own whirlwind. Her name leaked by noon on the second day, not by police, but by residents inside the building who had grown tired of her behavior. In the Pinnacle's private group chat, messages flew faster than she could read them. "How could you call the police on him?" One neighbor wrote, "You've lived here less than a year." Another said, "He's lived here 5. She tried to defend herself at first. "I was just trying to keep us safe," she typed. But the words fell flat. People shared old stories. How she clutched her purse when black delivery workers stepped off the elevator. How she avoided speaking to Elijah even when he helped her with groceries. She deleted her Facebook profile by the afternoon. By evening, she closed her blinds and kept the lights low, afraid of being recognized on the street. Fear had driven her to make the call. Now fear sat with her in her living room. But it felt different, sharper, colder, turning inward. Elijah, for his part, tried to stay grounded. His supervisor recommended he take leave. "You need time," she told him gently. "Your family needs time." He agreed, but he refused to disappear. The second evening, he joined a private therapy group made up of black professionals who had been wrongfully stopped or detained. Lawyers, professors, a cardiologist, a software engineer. Each had their own story. Elijah listened as others spoke, their voices steady, their memories still painful. When it was his turn, he hesitated. "I've been profiled before," he said slowly, "but this was different. This was home. My son sleeps there. My wife cooks there. I walk those halls every night, and suddenly it turned into a place where I had no protection." The room fell silent. One man nodded. "That's the part they never understand," he said. "It follows us even where we live." The second night, Sarah found Elijah sitting outside on the back porch, bundled in a blanket, staring at the dark shape of the trees. He heard her steps but didn't look up at first. "It's strange," he said softly. "Millions of people saw what happened. They're angry for me. They're shouting for me." He paused. "But the part I can't shake is that none of those people were there when it mattered." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "They're here now," she whispered. "And they're not letting this go." By the end of the second day, the movement had a name: Sanctuary Denied. Not a slogan, not a chant. Just a simple truth captured in 3 quiet words that described a wound too familiar for many and too shocking for others. It wasn't just Elijah's story anymore. It had become a mirror the country didn't want to look into, and yet could not turn away from. The legal battle began quietly, not with a dramatic courtroom moment, but with Elijah sitting beside his attorney at a long oak conference table, reviewing documents that laid out, line by line, every failure that led to his wrongful arrest. He spoke calmly, though each word carried the weight of a man who had spent his life believing the system could be repaired from within. "I want accountability," he said. "Not just for me, but for the next person who doesn't have a badge to hold up." His attorney nodded, already mapping out the path forward. The city's lawyers expected a negotiation. They did not expect the mountain of evidence that flooded their inboxes within the first week. Body cam footage, dispatch recordings, resident logs, statements from neighbors, and, most damaging of all, the 12 profiling complaints connected to Officer Ryan Caldwell. By the time they realized how indefensible the case was, millions of people had already drawn their own conclusions. Public opinion didn't decide the outcome, but it accelerated it. The city moved fast, not out of generosity but out of fear of what a trial would reveal. Within months, a structured settlement began taking shape. $6. $8 million from the city of New York for the unlawful arrest and emotional harm. $5,000 in punitive damages against Caldwell personally. $3,000 from Margaret Ellis for the reckless 911 call, and an additional $1.2 million from the Pinnacle residences for failing to establish proper training for residents on identifying actual emergencies. It was more than anyone expected. More than Elijah had imagined the first night he sat in that cold precinct room. But it was not victory. It was restitution. And restitution is never the same as justice. Caldwell's life unraveled with the slow, grinding inevitability of a man finally facing the consequences of everything he had ignored. The NYPD terminated him in January 2025, after the internal investigation confirmed not only misconduct, but a pattern of behavior that should have triggered action years earlier. When he cleaned out his locker, he found the old photo of his daughter tucked behind his gear, a picture he used to look at during long night shifts, the one that reminded him of the father he wanted to be. Now it felt like a judgment staring back at him. He moved into a small rental in Queens, the kind of apartment that held more silence than comfort. His wife, who had already been drifting away, filed for divorce within months. She cited irreconcilable harm. Though the truth was simpler, she could not watch him sink deeper into his own anger. His daughter, once his anchor, stopped calling him daddy. Their supervised visits were filled with stiff silence. And when she whispered, "Mom said you hurt someone innocent," Caldwell felt something inside him fracture. By spring, he was working mall security in New Jersey, earning $19 an hour, wearing a uniform that looked like a shadow of the one he once carried with pride. The weight of what he had done, what he had destroyed, settled in piece by painful piece. Margaret Ellis faced her own reckoning, one she had never imagined when she sat in her living room and dialed 911 with such certainty. The lawsuit arrived first, a thick envelope that made her hands tremble. The building manager called next, explaining in careful words that her presence had become a matter of safety concern among residents. After weeks of pressure, she agreed to sell her condo, absorbing a $400,000 loss in a housing market she once felt proud to navigate. Neighbors avoided her in the lobby during her final days there. She kept her hood up when walking to the elevator, ashamed but unsure how to express remorse. In March 2025, she suffered a minor heart attack. Brought on, doctors said, by stress. She survived. But the experience shook her into a quiet awareness she wished had come sooner. She wrote an apology letter to Elijah, 3 pages long, covered in crossed-out sentences and uncertain phrases. She never sent it. Shame kept her from sealing the envelope. It remained in her drawer, the paper aging slowly, the words growing heavier with time. As litigation unfolded, another transformation took place, this one at the institutional level. NYPD leadership, already under federal scrutiny, recognized they could not let this incident fade into another statistical footnote. Captain David Kwan and Sergeant Lena Ortiz pushed for reforms with a persistence rooted in responsibility, not optics. Their recommendations became policy by the end of the year. First, officers responding to residential calls were now required to verify residency through building staff or electronic logs before making arrests. It was a simple safeguard, one that should have existed years earlier. Second, any officer with 3 sustained profiling complaints automatically shifted to desk duty pending review, a measure designed to stop patterns before they escalated into catastrophe. Third, the department created a transparent public database listing complaints, outcomes, and officer histories. Some officers resisted at first, calling it excessive. Others, especially younger recruits, welcomed the change. They wanted a system that aligned with the values they hoped to carry forward. For the first time in years, reform felt possible, painful, costly, overdue, but possible. Elijah watched these developments from a distance, not detached but measured. The media wanted interviews, morning shows wanted sound bites, and advocacy groups wanted him to become the face of a national movement. He declined most invitations. "I'm not trying to be a symbol." He told Sarah one night, "I'm trying to rebuild." Yet, even in his silence, people saw him differently. Colleagues treated him with a reverence that felt strange. Strangers stopped him in grocery store aisles, speaking softly, thanking him for standing firm. But the truth was that Elijah did not feel like a hero. He felt like a man trying to piece together the remains of a world that had been cracked open in one hallway on one ordinary night. The money meant stability, but not healing. The settlement paid for therapy bills, legal fees, and a new security system Sarah insisted on. Even though Elijah hated the idea of more cameras watching him, what hurt most were the small changes. Jamal flinching when a police cruiser passed, Sarah locking the door twice instead of once, Elijah hesitating in his own lobby, scanning faces out of habit. Trauma does not vanish with court decisions. It lingers in gestures, in quiet moments, in the careful way a man enters his home. And yet, as the months passed, something else took shape, a sense of purpose Elijah did not seek but could not ignore. People wrote to him. Some shared their own stories. Some simply said, "Because of you, I filed my complaint." The voice that had been ignored in the hallway now echoed across communities far beyond Manhattan. He hadn't asked for that influence, but he started to understand that perhaps this was part of the work he had always wanted to do. Protecting not just against threats from outside, but against the dangers built into systems that should have protected everyone. But healing would come later. The collapse had come first, and it came with force, swift, painful, unyielding. It brought consequences to those who had long avoided them, and it pushed New York City into a conversation it could no longer ignore. The city council chamber was crowded the morning Elijah Harper stepped up to the microphone, a quiet figure in a dark suit who carried himself with the steady composure of a man who had spent his life working in crisis, yet still felt uneasy speaking about his own. Cameras lined the back wall. Reporters leaned forward. Residents from every borough sat in the gallery, some with folded arms, some with tissues in hand, all waiting for the man whose arrest had forced a city to confront the cracks in its own foundation. Elijah paused for a moment before beginning, breathing in slowly, offering a small nod to Sarah in the front row. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, deliberate, carrying not anger but a measured clarity that gave every word weight. "I want to make something very clear," he said. "I had the badge, I had the key, I had the neighbors, I had the doorman, and none of it mattered, because I am a black man living in a building where some people still believe we don't belong." The room fell silent. Not polite silence. Heavy silence. Elijah continued, steady as a metronome. He described the moment in the hallway, the disbelief in Caldwell's eyes, the fear in his own son's voice when he watched the video. "If it can happen to me," he said, "what chance does the average black New Yorker have? What chance does anyone have who cannot pull out a federal badge to prove their existence?" Across the room, heads lowered, some nodded, some closed their eyes. His words carved through the chamber with the honesty of someone who had already lived the consequences. After his testimony, after the council members thanked him and cameras followed him into the hall, Elijah stepped outside for air. He was halfway down the steps when a voice called his name. It was soft, almost hesitant. Agent Harper. He turned and saw Ryan Caldwell standing a few yards away, wearing a simple collared shirt and jacket, without a badge, without the authority that once shaped every part of his life. He looked smaller than Elijah remembered, not physically, but in presence. Caldwell approached slowly, as if uncertain whether he had the right to close the distance. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said. Elijah studied him quietly. "I didn't agree," he said. "You approached me." Caldwell swallowed hard. "I know." He said, I needed to say something." His voice cracked in a way that surprised even him. "I was wrong." The words fell between them, plain and unpolished. "I should have checked the logs. I should have listened. I should have." Elijah lifted a hand gently, not to silence him, but to stop him from unraveling. "This isn't about you anymore," Elijah said softly. "And it can't be." Caldwell blinked. Stunned by the clarity, Elijah continued, voice low. "I survived that night. Another person might not have. What we do next, what this city does next, is about the next kid, the next father, the next neighbor who gets judged before he's even allowed to speak." Caldwell lowered his gaze, realizing the apology he thought might free him could not undo the roots of the harm. He nodded once, stepped back, and walked away with the slow, uneven steps of a man carrying the truth for the first time instead of running from it. In the months that followed, as the settlement checks cleared and citywide reforms began taking shape, Elijah worked to rebuild the parts of his life that had quietly cracked. Jamal returned to school, still cautious around police but slowly regaining laughter in small doses. A basketball game in the driveway, a new science project he insisted on showing his father. a late-night conversation about courage and fear. Sarah resumed her lectures at NYU, bringing Elijah coffee on long workdays and grounding him with the simple stability of routine. Elijah himself began speaking at small gatherings first. Church basements, community centers, law school panels, then larger ones. Not out of ambition, but out of necessity. Each time he spoke, he told the same truth. This is not about anger. It's about accountability. It's about respect. It's about belonging in your own home. People listened. People learned. And gradually, his voice became part of a larger chorus calling for change inside the NYPD. The reforms sparked by his case began reshaping the way officers responded to residential calls. Young recruits were trained differently, taught to verify before acting, taught to question assumptions, taught to treat every resident with dignity, regardless of appearance. Complaints were no longer buried in filing cabinets. They were logged, tracked, made visible. Officers with repeated profiling complaints were pulled from the streets until they completed mandatory training. The department did not transform overnight, but for the first time in many years, it moved with intention instead of resistance. The most profound change, however, happened not in policy, but in the quiet spaces where people reflected on what they had seen. In apartment buildings across the city, residents spoke more cautiously before dialing 911. Doormen intervened more assertively. Neighbors greeted each other with more awareness. Elijah's story became part of civic memory. One of those incidents people referenced by date, the way others spoke of watershed moments in their own lives. More than a year after the arrest, Elijah stood again in the hallway outside apartment 3204. The same soft red light glowed above the door. The same framed art hung along the corridor. But everything felt different. Jamal walked beside him, hand tucked into his father's, eyes scanning the hallway not with fear now, but with a young boy's curiosity. Sarah followed, smiling softly when Elijah paused at the door. He touched the fob to the panel. It beeped, the same familiar sound as before, but this time it carried a new resonance, a restoration, a reclamation. Elijah opened the door, stepped inside, and breathed in the scent of home, warm, quiet, lived in. Jamal threw his arms around him in a sudden burst of affection. Elijah held him close, feeling the steady heartbeat of a child who had endured too much for his age. He whispered, "This is our home, and we belong here." Sarah watched them, her eyes soft, her heart full. Weeks later, a quiet report released by the NYPD revealed something remarkable. False residential arrests had dropped by 41% since the new reforms. The change was real, but another number weighed on Elijah, a reminder that the struggle was far from over. More than 1,200 profiling complaints remained pending across the city. Change had begun, but the work stretched ahead like a long, uneven road. Elijah walked that road with the steady stride of someone who had already lived the consequences and refused to let them define him. He moved forward not as a victim, but as a man who transformed pain into purpose, who spoke not for recognition, but for protection, who carried his story into rooms that needed to hear it. And though he did not seek a legacy, one formed around him anyway, in the policies rewritten, in the conversations sparked, in the quiet assurance he gave others simply by standing tall. For in the end, his story was not only about an arrest, it was about the fragile promise of sanctuary, the cost of prejudice, and the enduring truth that justice begins not in courtrooms, but in the courage of those who refuse to stay silent. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it moved you, if it made you think, take a second to subscribe, leave a like, and share it with someone who cares about justice. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most.